If you're faced with the daunting task of crafting a literature review for your dissertation or thesis or research project, this video is for you. And it's a little different from our usual content. In this video, we're releasing a recording of our popular Literature Review 101 webinar, which has been attended by thousands of students over the last year. The webinar is hosted by one of our trusty grad coaches, Dr. Karen Warren, and in it, we cover pretty much everything you need to get started putting together a high quality lit review. So grab a cup of coffee or tea or whatever you like, sit back, relax, and enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Derek. And yes, today's webinar is all about the literature review, and it's quite short, so that we'll try and pack in quite a bit. But I think a good place to start is just to sort of just define what we mean by a literature review. So what is a literature review? Most simply, a literature review is just a chapter in your dissertation or thesis that provides some kind of academic overview of key literature relevant to your research topic, what you're going to be doing. And in many ways, it composes of two parts, the reading of the literature and the writing of this chapter, at least from an action perspective for the average student. And it's also worthwhile thinking about why this chapter even exists. Why not just rely on sort of the background of your introduction, for instance, which can have a little bit of touch points that are quite similar. But the literature review takes us a step further. It takes the reader into the academic realm. It places your research, it sets the scene for your research in the academic context. It allows me as the reader to understand what you're expecting based on past research or past things. And in many ways, I should be able to foreshadow what it is that you're going to be doing and perhaps what you might even find. And for that purpose, this literature review is really there to provide enough information for the reader, sort of get a sense as to where you will be and what purpose your research has in the grand scheme of things. And with these two phases, the reading and the writing, what I personally tend to find is that many students will get stuck in one of these spots more than in the other. So you'll get the student who doesn't even know where to start with the reading, and you'll get the student who's read everything. Their mind is so full of stuff, and they just don't know where to start writing because there's just so much going on in their brain right now. And for that reason, I always suggest a little bit of iteration between reading and writing, where you read a little bit and you ask yourself, okay, well, is this relevant? You give a shot at writing, and that will sort of reveal the extent to which some of the literature that you've been touching on is potentially relevant or should be explored in a bit more depth. And then you go back and you get some more of that kind of literature that sort of helps fill that gap. So there's often, for many people who do this chapter well, or at least quickly, there tends to be a little bit of iteration between these two sections, although the net direction is from the reading to the writing phase. So now that we have a working definition and we understand the general reasons behind why a literature review chapter even exists, it's worth now thinking, okay, well, what goes into this chapter? And I'm not going to talk about the structure of the chapter just yet. We'll make a brief mention of it later. But what elements need to at least be there? And for me, I think that there are three key things that I like to see in a literature review that needs to be considered by you early on while you're even reviewing the literature, because this will help. The first thing is the theory. The theory that, and by theory I mean the set of explanations that help the reader understand what you might potentially find and why it is that you might find that. So for some literature on theories, they tend to be very broad, about broad societal ways that society works, and the theoretical frameworks that you might use are therefore potentially very broad. And sometimes the theories are very specific and create very specific measurable units that you as the researcher can perhaps go out and survey and get responses and actually measure. A more measurable version of a theory is known as the conceptual framework. The theoretical framework are the set of theories or set of ideas and explanations at a high level that help you sort of contextualize and understand what it is that you might find and what it is that you might expect to find based on an explanation that's been provided by previous authors. These kinds of theoretical expectations of theoretical ideas come from often very well cited core literature that tends to be a little older and may not have any empirical evidence, meaning that they might not have direct collected this data, but they've more thought about data that's already been collected and tried to propose some kind of explanation as to why other researchers are perhaps finding certain things. So for that reason, we need to be able to sort of identify the theories that are being used by you as the researcher or that you think might be the most relevant, be able to justify why that is the case. And if those theories are composed of various elements, which we call construct, you need to sort of outline what those constructs are and and sort of how they might work or how they might look in the context of your own research. And we'll use an example a little bit later if this feels a little bit out there. But point one is that there has to be some theory in your research or some explanation as to how it is that your research may end up looking like based on current understandings. The second thing that is very important for this chapter is empirical research. It's one thing to have a set of explanations as to why things might look the way they look, but is there any reason to believe from studies that have actually collected data as to what other people have found? Are they finding something similar to what these theories are suggesting? Are there perhaps ambiguities and differences? And for the research that is very similar to perhaps what you are studying, you're probably wanting to go into a little bit of detail. For instance, what did they find? What kind of methodology did they use? How did they find this out? And also, very relevant, is there any variation between these studies or limitation to these studies, which of course you as the researcher might be able to, point out as something that might be missing, which brings us to the third element of this chapter, and that is the research gap. So if other people have been finding ambiguous findings or their scope of their research just doesn't touch on something that you're wanting to look at and just doesn't go as far as what you would like to know about, then you have justification, academic justification for your research in that it might fill a gap, an existing gap, by either shedding light as to why there might be ambiguity or supporting certain ambiguous positions, or maybe even filling an entire gap that's just not touched on, whether it's the context of the study that you're doing, maybe, and we're going to go to an example that involves context in a moment, or maybe the methodology. Maybe past research is only focused on qualitative stuff, and you're wanting to now see whether this qualitative finding is seen at a broader level, maybe using some kind of quantitative research like a survey in order to see if other people feel the same way as maybe those samples that were interviewed individually. And with that, you're ultimately saying why your research matters in the academic context, because you're helping to fill a niche that is currently perhaps unknown or still uncertain. So, to recap, what you need in this chapter is a bit of theory, right? Enough theory to help the reader understand the explanations behind what you might find. A little bit of empirical research, to maybe not even a little bit, maybe even a lot of empirical research that tells the reader what other people have been doing and what they've been finding. And third, the research gap. So highlighting what those empirical studies and what this theory is currently not including and what your research might end up shedding light on. So those are the three elements. Let's look at an example to make it a little bit more concrete. So in terms of these examples, we're going to use this potential topic. This topic, as far as I know, doesn't exist, so please don't go Googling it. The acceptance and use of technology for teaching among preschool teachers in France. Now, let's say that this is the research that you're doing, and you've been reading up on a bunch of theories, and you've decided that the technological acceptance model, TAM model, is what you're going to be using. This is an existing model. Now you might not know a lot about this kind of stuff, but I want to sort of point out that not all models and theories and explanations will be this concrete and measurable. This is me cheating a little bit by giving you a much sort of cleaner, neater theory than perhaps what you might get if you're doing a little bit more of a qualitative study, and you're probably bringing in a little bit more variable theories that help explain how society works at large, like perhaps intersectional feminism or queer theory or a combination of theory. But in this particular example, let's pretend that it is this easy and we can just kind of pluck one theory that has a nice, clean, easily measured model associated with it, or a conceptual framework accepted with it. What I expect from you, yeah, is to firstly not ignore all other theories on technology acceptance and use. I'd like you to at least mention that you acknowledge that they exist, but still on why the TAM model is useful for you. And for this, you probably don't need a lot of text, but you do need at least a couple of paragraphs highlighting what kinds of theories exist and why the TAM model specifically, this model specifically, is used in the context of your research. So you want to provide some ideas as to what the purpose of this model is. And that could be anything. It doesn't have to be the best explanation. You don't have to, you don't have to worry about how convincing you are. Whether your reasons are practical, like this model is simple, or this model has been used by other education researchers, that's a great reason to settle on a model like this, as long as it helps you answer your research question or helps you shed light on your own research in some way. So you want to sort of settle on the model and explain why this one or this theory is the best for you. You also probably would like to explain the model a bit, right? So you can see this is the conceptual framework version of the model, but you can see it's composed of various elements that seem to sort of lead to each other. They seem to influence each other. So for me as the reader, you probably would like me to at least know what those are, not just as a definition, but as a working concept. So perceived usefulness, what do you mean by perceived usefulness? How is it meant to influence actual usage at the end of the day? And so you want to go into a little bit more detail around the workings of these various constructs and why they are relevant and how they're interconnected as well, even if it's relatively briefly for each one.
Hey, Derek here again. I wanted to quickly jump in to tell you about our free literature review template. If you're in the process of crafting your literature review, this template will help you structure your thinking and fast track your writing. If you're interested, you can find the free download link in the description. All right, back to the webinar.
The second thing that we remember that we need is empirical research. So some of the research that you might have been reading might fit nicely into the TAM model, and you might actually use that research integrated into your theory and perhaps use them as examples as to the application of those various constructs or the application of this model as a whole. However, you probably find that other past empirical studies don't use this model. Maybe they use other models. Maybe they're just a little bit more general or descriptive or qualitative, and yet they sort of focus in on different ideas. Some ideas might be preschool education and available technologies that are even just there. Because if you don't know what kinds of technologies exist, why would you expect teachers to even use, technologies in their teaching? Maybe you're wanting to sort of look at how this research is typically studied. So for instance, going into the qualitative, if there is qualitative research out there, maybe there are ethnographers that look and observe what teachers are doing and what they're using. You probably also realize that there are studies done outside of your context or a little bit more broadly. Maybe there's a lot of research that uses TAM or talks about teacher acceptance at a broad level for high schoolers or middle schoolers or primary school but they don't look at preschool teachers. In which case, you might want to at least briefly bring up some of that other research to highlight what other kinds of teachers are doing, and then hone into the preschool teacher context. And together, this might bring you to eventually start pointing out or pointing to the areas that this research is currently missing, which may be very broad, like preschool teachers in general, although I doubt it, but it is very likely very specific, like preschool teachers in France or in this context. If that is what is missing in the current literature, that is your research gap. But in order to highlight that research gap, you need to sort of fill in the rest of the picture as to what currently is being done in order to kind of point out that area that is missing a lot more cleanly. So what tends to happen is you'll tend to have a lot of different kinds of studies talked about, whether they're sort of studies that are only briefly mentioned because maybe it's about high school teachers and you don't need to go into all the details around the studies in that case. And then maybe teachers that are preschool teachers that have been studied, but they're in the US and Japan, you might want to go into a little bit more detail around and then eventually say, look, yeah, there's some differences between these different contexts from this current empirical research. France is a different context too. Maybe we should be expecting something else, thereby justifying the fact that context matters and therefore there is need for research in France for this particular question. So that's how you can use these three elements in this particular kind of literature review for this research project. Okay, so now what do we do about it? So now we've got all these different elements. We have to go through each construct of our theories or our models. We have to, put what theories or what theory we're using in context. We have perhaps other research that doesn't directly fit into these theories, but does shed light on the topic in general. We have the research gap. What do we do with this? Now, the big issue with the literature review, in my perspective, is that every single literature review that you read will look a little bit different. And that's because the nature of the question means that the kinds of ways in which you blend these elements together might be different. For somebody who has a very clear-cut theory, they might just go according to the structure that we've just mentioned, the theory, the empirical research and the research gap. But for many people, there might be parts that they will blend together, maybe some empirical research that they might want to put before some and after others. So a lot of this big stuff and how you put it together might differ a little bit, in which case think of these various elements as building blocks and kind of jot down the various elements that need to be in the study that you've been reading about and kind of just like pop them into different orders, see which logically flows in your brain. Regardless of how these flow, it's not a bad idea to just consider a classic literature review structure in general, at least at a macro scale. And that involves just having an introduction with a brief overview as to what the reader might expect from this particular chapter, and maybe pointing to what your own research has already, shown to be about from your introduction chapter. Then you'll have the body of the research, which involves all of these elements that you might have, put into a specific order that makes sense to you. And then you'll have sort of a chapter conclusion, which will essentially be a brief summary of the key things that the reader needs to understand from this chapter, as well as some kind of clean transition into this next chapter. So perhaps you would like to, for instance, reiterate your research gap and say, from these studies, it is clear that good quality quantitative research needs to be done in the context of preschool teachers in France. This research will help shed light on this issue and bridge this research gap. And, you're going to be discussing that in the following chapter. So that is sort of a classic structure to the literature review, although the bits and bobs that make up the body, the middle bit, consider starting to play around with that and see what sort of order makes logical sense. You can always cut and paste a section and put it before another section and afterwards. As long as you read through and edit it afterwards, then if it helps, you can always do some post writing editing. Once you have that sort of order done, just start writing. Start writing the section that is easiest for you to write. So now that we've covered what this might look like and what needs to be in it, what are they looking for? And in this particular context, they might be external reviewers, they might be part of your committee, they might be your supervisor if this is, maybe a first or second draft that you've, sort of been working on. And so, whoever they are, they tend to want three key things and then sort of more of a ethereal fourth thing, which we'll get into in a moment. But the first of the three key things is they want to see that you have an understanding of the theory. And by understanding, they want you to have engaged with the theory enough to show that you have an idea as to what an adequate use of this theory is for your research, that you've identified and probably defined with some level of practical definition as to how the constructs or elements within this theory can be used in research like yours. They want to see that you didn't just choose this theory randomly, that this theory makes sense for your research and that you have a good reason as to why you're using this theory. And they need to see how this theory might be used to provide you with a set of expectations in quantitative research hypotheses or propositions that you can use for your own research. The second thing they look for is engagement and criticality. And this is something that I see very frequently among clients and students where they get back some stuff from their supervisor and they say, and the feedback is it's too descriptive, there needs to be more criticality. I don't like using the word criticality because what it tends to do is it tends to sort of imply that what you need to do is you need to criticize the existing literature. I tend to prefer the word engagement. And the reason there is because you don't need to criticize the literature. A very good article can be very well received, could have really had a profound influence on the field, but that doesn't mean it's without limitations. Pointing out those limitations and the scope and how far that paper might be able to help explain things, but where that boundary is in terms of its explanatory power is something that is very powerful. So you don't need to criticize the literature so much as you need to be critical of the literature and engage with it. What is this piece of research actually telling me? Is there something limited perhaps in their methodological use? Maybe a limitation might not necessarily be a bad thing. It's an inevitable thing for everyone's writing. But it might be that this study has been conducted in the US. And if your study is in France, there's limitations in its applicability to your context that has nothing to do with the way in which that research might have been carried out. However, some research might be limited in the fact that maybe the authors could only get a small sample size, and therefore their research isn't very generalizable. And now we need to understand perhaps a broader context. So, unpacking and engaging with this literature in terms of not just pointing out the limitations and the things that are bad about the literature and the lack of scope, but also in how this sheds light on your own research is very important. And so, with that level of engagement and criticality embedded ideally throughout the literature review, although you don't need to be very heavy handed about it and do it for every single study, is a very useful way of showing that you have an academic understanding as to how to look at research broadly. And then the third thing is that you have a clearly articulated research gap. If everyone else has studied everything that we need to know, can we just pack up and go home? Do you even need to do your study? Obviously not. There's a reason why you still need to sort of shed light on this issue. Maybe that reason is that there's just too much conflicting information in the literature currently. Therefore, you will need to sort of help bridge that gap. In medical sciences, there's a lot of research that is repeated by multiple different researchers in order to sort of come to some conclusion, often because it's very hard to get a decent enough sample size to be super conclusive. So you're still helping bridge a research gap because there might still be ambiguity and uncertainty because a lot of the research currently is only using small sample sizes. The research gap might be in the context. As mentioned in our example, maybe there's research in the US and Japan, but in France, we've got reason to believe that there's contextual differences that may influence those teachers. So if you clearly articulate what that research gap is, then that's great. So make sure, plan, and think about how you would describe that. At a higher level, what I want to see when I read a literature review is I want to have this sense of anticipation as to what it is that you're going to be doing and kind of what it is that you're most likely to find based on current literature and theory. It's very rare that we have absolutely no idea what we might find. There might be some push and pull depending on the theories that you're using in one direction or the other. And it's very important to understand what it is that you'd expect, but also maybe to anticipate what your research is going to be doing. If you've spent the entire dissertation talking about how there's a lack of quantitative research in this area, or that people haven't adequately studied this looked at teachers, they've only looked at parents and children themselves, I'm going to expect you to do a quantitative study on teachers because you've been leading me up to that point. So I want you to sort of read through your literature review with a sense of, does the reader have enough context that without me even telling them what I'm going to do, they have perhaps a working understanding as to what I might end up doing? Then that's good. Then you've done your job in writing your literature review. So now, how do you even get to that point? How do you even get to that point where you can even start reading your literature review and reviewing it to make sure that it has some of those things that they are looking for? I think depending on where you are and why you're here at this webinar, there are some areas that you can maybe start thinking about or start looking. If you're right at the beginning, then start collecting articles. And I call this the browsing phase. And the reason I call this the browsing phase is because I feel like a lot of us, and I've been guilty of this as well, is we want to get the perfect article and we want to read it top to tail and we want to memorize everything in it. And what tends to happen is we get overwhelmed with the level of information in that article. But I want to encourage you to perhaps go onto Google Scholar and just sort of type in those keywords and see what it is that you're getting. Read those titles, read through some of those abstracts, and start getting a sense as to what people are even saying about this issue at a high level first. And once you've done that, then you can start, sort of downloading those articles and reading the ones that seem to be the most aligned with your own research a little bit more deeply. Whether that's, going through the images that they're showing and maybe just looking at reading lightly through the text and really just getting a sense as to what might end up being the core pieces that will make it into your final review and the ones that you might end up leaning on the most. So start collecting some articles and kind of be a little bit gentle with yourself. Allow yourself that little learning curve in terms of what is relevant, understanding what is relevant, what is not relevant, and learning some of the terms and ideas behind what it is that you're doing. Once you've started browsing the literature, allow yourself moments to sort of step back and almost journal to yourself, what have I been reading and why is this relevant to my study? The reason this reflection is so important is because it's very easy to get lost down a rabbit hole on every kind of technology that teachers have ever used, on all the research on high school teachers, on all of the different kinds of theories of technological acceptance and use. And you start getting sort of bogged down with all this information and overwhelmed. Whereas if you have these moments of just being like, okay, well, what have I actually kind of been reading about? Not at a detailed level. You're not expected to know how many participants were in this study or that study or remember all the authors' names or anything like that. But at a high level, what have you been reading? And is this relevant to my study? You'll probably realize that some things are actually a lot more relevant than others. And maybe the things that were less relevant were somewhat surprising. So try not to get yourself going down that rabbit hole and just collecting literature maniacally, but have moments of pause where you ask yourself about the relevance of various pieces. Maybe even rank your readings in terms of relevance. Once you've done that, once you've got a working understanding as to what's going on, even if maybe some of the extra details are still missing, getting a sense of the key concepts that are relevant in your theory, in the empirical research, and kind of what is being done at a high level as well. Once you've got this list of key concepts. Give it a review. Think about, okay, well, is this something that really needs to be in the study? Can I maybe group this concept with that concept, or this idea with that idea? And start just playing around with the major themes, concepts that will make an appearance in this chapter. And maybe even start figuring out which readings go into which concept. Once you have that, it is very, very easy, or at least much easier, to start creating a chapter outline or a chapter structure. Because once you have those key concepts, you can start playing that game of, sort of which one needs to go first, what goes before that. And once you have that structure, it's possible for you to actually start thinking, hey, actually, I can write about this section already. I don't need to wait to know everything about this section yet. I can just start with that section and just actually allow you to get that writing process flowing. So having a chapter structure and your key concepts already written out, it's a very empowering place to start.
All right, so that wraps up the Literature Review 101 webinar. Remember, we've got a ton of free resources over on the Grad Coach blog to help you fast track your lit review. As always, you can find the links in the description. If you enjoyed the video, please do remember to hit the like and subscribe buttons, and be sure to check out this video next. I'll see you there.